Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure. We've heard from our keynote speaker, Karen Cross, this morning, and now we're going to hear from Alex Schadenberg. Alex is the founder and the director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. He's graciously consented to travel here to South Dakota, all the way from the country of Canada, to be with us. He's consented to speak graciously on the topic, preventing the spread of assisted suicide in America. We're so honored to have Alex with us today. Alex, come.
How do I use that mic? Okay. So this is my second time in South Dakota. I spoke quite a few years ago in Hoven, and I don't remember what year it was at the convention that you had, but I remember being there. Yeah, and I was at a church, and I remember all that. Yes, I guess I'm not too old to forget yet, but anyway. I don't have all good news to share with you, and I know this is South Dakota, and thank God there's no laws permitting assisted suicide in South Dakota. My slide, oh, there it changes. But the fact of it is assisted suicide has been spreading throughout the U.S., and many of you know it started in the state of Oregon many years ago, and then the assisted suicide lobby failed and failed and failed for 11 years to get a second law passed in the U.S., and then Washington State in 2009. And they've been gaining about almost one state a year, but I do have good news that in 2022, the assisted suicide lobby put a ton of pressure into quite a few states because they saw this as a key year for their victories, and they lost everywhere. There's no new state in 2022 that legalized assisted suicide. And that's good news. So the whole thing about assisted suicide is that a lot of us are concerned about beginning of life issues, and we think that, and we recognize the threat of killing the babies, and that's a very important issue. But you know, we have to be well aware and prepared, because I know there's been a bill here in South Dakota in the past, and I know there's going to be bills again. There's going to be pressure to legalize assisted suicide. And what the assisted suicide lobby does is it's trying to find its allies in different states. So you might say, well, why would there be a bill in South Dakota? The odds of them getting it passed are almost nothing. And that might be true at this time, but they're trying to find their allies in order to prepare for the day when they do have greater numbers in South Dakota. But they're involved with other things now too, and I'm going to get into that because I'm going to get into whole issues about what they're doing, the assisted suicide lobby, the death lobby. So many people view assisted suicide within the paradigm of suicide, so which most people would see as a negative act, but they see it as a personal act. So they sell this to us as assisted suicide is an act I do to myself. They would say it's my body, my choice. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. So they justify assisted suicide based on the idea that the person's dying anyway, and that we're all doing this, so we're just simply reducing their time of suffering because, you know, they're dying anyway. And many people are also uncomfortable, or they're afraid of a bad death. So they combine the stories, the very difficult stories of someone who might have been going through a terrible condition, and they combine that with people's fear. And I know someone said to me earlier in the hallway when I was talking to them about this, they said, yes, but we're supposed to accept our sufferings. And I'm not going to argue with that, but I just know that most human beings universally are afraid of a bad death. We don't like the idea of suffering, even if we should accept our suffering. But we oppose assisted suicide. Now, assisted suicide is what? Some people will say, well, it's not the same as abortion. And I say, well, actually, it is. How the laws work is the doctor gains the right in law to cause your death. It's about killing you. Now, technically, with assisted suicide, you might do the act yourself, but what is happening is a doctor or in some states, a nurse might be the one who's now agreeing. They're agreeing that your life is not worth living. They're saying, we agree your life's not worth living. We'll give you the means, the lethal drug combination in order to cause your death. It's about killing you. And of course, assisted suicide and euthanasia, I'm going to get into also. They're two birds of a feather. They're a little different, but they flock together. Euthanasia is what? It's homicide, right? It's actually someone injecting you. We oppose assisted suicide because it's the act of knowingly prescribing or providing lethal drugs to a person upon request, and usually that person is going through depression or they're going through a very difficult time in their life. And we have to always, I always tell people as I'm getting into my talk, I say, remember, you're a human being. As humans, we go through emotional, psychological, spiritual, distress at times in our life. So if we're going through a difficult health condition, we're also going to often be experiencing a difficult psychological, emotional, spiritual state also. So when someone's talking about ending their life, sometimes what they need to hear is, no, you're important to me, or no, I will be with you, I will help you. Why? Because they're going through such a distress that they're not actually in their normal frame of mind, okay? And so we have to understand this. Legalizing assisted suicide, what do those laws actually do? I say to people, when we're talking about assisted suicide, you have to say, what does the law actually say? Because the assisted suicide lobby, similar to the death abortion lobby, they're going to sell a lie. But what does the law actually say? That's what's so important about these things. Because what these laws actually do is they get physicians. Now, I put in here nurse practitioners because the law in New Mexico allows nurse practitioners to be involved. The Canadian law is the same way, and that's a big push by the assisted suicide lobby to expand who can do the act. It gives them the right in law to cause your death. That's what it does. If you read these laws, what do? Yes, someone has to request it. So they would say, oh, it's my body, my choice. You know, I requested it. But the law actually isn't about that at all. The law is about the rules that the doctor or the nurse practitioner must follow in order to cause your death. That's what the law is about. They set out the rules they must follow to cause your death. So these laws are about what? Doctors following rules to kill you. That's what they're about, okay? We oppose killing people. Assisted suicide, well, it's legal now in California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, New Mexico, enacted in 2021. It's a little different there. Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and the District of Columbia. And then Montana has a court decision, so therefore technically in Montana, assisted suicide is not legal, but the Baxter court decision, which was in 2009, created what they call a defensive consent. So a doctor who would assist a suicide could simply say, if they were prosecuted under the law, they could simply say, I simply consented to the request of my patient in this circumstance. They created a defensive consent. So technically it's illegal, but the court made it legal. It sounds like Canada. Like we have that all the time, courts making laws. Anyway, that's what Dobbs actually did. The Dobbs decision undid a Supreme Court decision, which was terrible. New jurisdictions being, there was no new jurisdictions, but we remain concerned always about Massachusetts. Why? Because there's a big push in Massachusetts right now in the courts to legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, how do most of these laws work? And I think it's important to look at this. And I've already said this to you, how the law actually works. A person must request a lethal dose. Well, that's the beginning and the end for your choices. The rest is about the doctor or the nurse. You have most of the laws. New Mexico is a little bit different, though. But anyway, a doctor must examine the person and determine if they qualify under the law. A second doctor usually doesn't examine the person at all. The second doctor usually is just affirming what the first doctor said. So when you read these laws, these bills and these laws, the second approval is usually not based on meeting the actual person. So if you had a medical condition, let's say you had a mistaken diagnosis, and the first doctor, being really pro-assisted suicide, is like, yeah, I wouldn't want to live like you either. I will agree. We're going to prescribe you these lethal drugs. I need a second doctor to approve it. The second doctor is simply looking at the medical record usually and what the first doctor said and signing them off. The person must pick up the lethal dose from the pharmacy. Once the lethal dose is obtained from the pharmacy, now in New Mexico they don't even have to pick it up, someone else could pick it up anyway. The lethal dose is obtained from the pharmacy. There's no further oversight of the law. Now, why is this important? When someone dies by assisted suicide, we don't actually know how they died. Right? There's no further oversight of the law. There's no requirement in any of these laws that there be a doctor present, that there be a third party, meaning an independent person present to ensure that the law was followed. All we know is that person's dead and the lethal drugs were used. Okay? That's all we know. We don't know more than that. And so therefore, let's say somebody didn't actually take it themselves, so it was actually euthanasia. It was actually a homicide. Would we know? No, there's no way to know. The law has no oversight. Once the person died, the physician who wrote the prescription must submit a report to the government. So how are these laws designed? First doctor who approves your death is the same one who can write the prescription for the lethal drugs. is the same one who sends in a report. So if you look at the Oregon data, the doctor who wrote the prescription is almost never at the death. Almost never there. And yet they're submitting this report to the government. And I'm going to get into that data a little bit too, how often the reports are not being submitted. But the point of it is what does this mean? It's a self-reporting system. Self-reporting system. In every jurisdiction where it's legal, it's a self-reporting system. So when you're driving down the highway at a super speed because you're late for your pro-life meeting, do you call the police to come arrest you because you were speeding? Well, of course not. See, so therefore, obviously, in a self-reporting system, do we actually know what's happening? No, the law is designed for what? It's designed to protect physicians who are willing to be involved with causing your death. And it makes sense if you think about it. If a doctor's involved with causing your death, and they did something which was really questionable, and there were some family members upset about it, obviously the doctors would not be willing to be involved in that if they felt there were going to be repercussions to them. So the laws completely protect them. These are laws that protect them when they're trying to kill you. So let me go through some of this Oregon 2021 data with you. My wife always tells me, why do you go through the data? It's boring, it's not really about a story. But I think you should look at this data just because it shows you some things in the laws that are really important, and you can see how really it's all a lie. Okay, so according to the 2021 Oregon Assisted Suicide Report, there was 238 reported assisted deaths. There were actually more than that, but let me get into it. In 2021, the ingestion status was unknown in 106 deaths. So if you look at the report, it says there were 238 reported assisted suicide deaths. So that means the doctor prescribed the lethal drugs, and there was a death, and the doctor sent in a report. But according to the report, there was 106 deaths. They don't know what happened. So these are people who received the lethal drugs. They died, but we don't know how they died. No report was sent in. They might have died a natural death, that's true, or they might have died of assisted suicide. We just don't know. And so when they put in the data, they make it very clear that when the ingestion status is unknown, they don't know how that person died. They just don't know, okay? They are approved for assisted suicide. So let's think about this. We're talking about a situation where doctors are involved with killing people, and there's 106 people who received lethal drugs, and we just don't know how they died. Does that make you feel good? That's a good idea? Of course not. Well, that's gone up because in 2020, there was 80 deaths in the report that said they did not know. They were unknown deaths. They didn't know how they died. So, of course, so it went from 80 to 106 in 1 year. That's a big jump. Now, every year the report had a number, and every year it's gone up a bit. So what we're having is, I believe, we're having under-reporting of assisted suicide. So when they talked about, you might have heard talks years ago about the Dutch euthanasia law, and they would always say, according to the data, there's about 20% of the euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands that are not reported. Well, you're getting actually pretty close to that in Oregon. You're getting pretty close. But I don't know for sure because there's no way to know, because there's no third party looking at it. There's no studies. There's nothing to prove what's happening. The time of death ranged from 1 minute to 47 hours in 2019. This is supposed to be a death with dignity, and the person took 47 hours to die. The longest time of death in Oregon has been 104 hours. 104 hours. There were several people who didn't die. They received the lethal drugs. They were, they went into a deep coma type thing for several days, and then they came out of it and wondered what happened. 2 people were referred for a psychological or psychiatric evaluation. Now, let's put this in perspective. Everybody in this room, we're all human. Now think about this. If you're going through some terminal or significant medical condition, is it not normal for you to also be going through a difficult emotional or psychological reaction to that? Remember, you could be the person of great faith, but you're a human being. These are difficult things for us to experience. We have physical bodies, right? So you're telling me that only 2 people needed to be referred out of the 238 reported assisted suicide deaths, that only 2 people needed to be referred for a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. It's actually worse than that because the number of actual prescriptions was like 380, so they're actually saying 2 out of 380. You're telling me that that's the reality? Of course that's not the reality. What it means is that the assisted suicide doctors really don't care. That's what it means. That's what it means. One physician was referred to the Oregon Medical Board in 2021 for failure to comply with the law. Anyway, the assisted suicide lobby right now is really working to expand assisted suicide in America. That's their big thing. They've been pushing very hard on several things, but they've changed their tactics in the last few years. So first of all, they're doing what they were always trying to do, which was legalize assisted suicide in more states. Now, you've had bills here before in South Dakota. Almost every state has had a bill before, and most of those bills have been defeated. So if you look at the data, almost every assisted suicide bill over the years has been defeated. But of course, the sad thing is, of course, if they win once, of course, then they have got assisted suicide in that state, and then they claim a big victory. Prime example, in Connecticut, they've lost 10 years in a row. 10 years in a row they've lost. And Connecticut's a very left state, right? And that's because there's some Democrats who are voting against it every time. So that's a good thing. Nonetheless, if let's say next year they won in Connecticut, there'd be this big victory thing. Assisted suicide is, the big wave is going. That's what they would say, when in fact they lost 10 years in a row. We need to make sure they always lose. Where assisted suicide is legal, they're not trying to expand the laws. I'm going to go into that. Well, how are they trying to expand the laws? Eliminating waiting periods. Their goal is same-day death. Think about this. You're going through a difficult time. You're having a very difficult, let's say you're experiencing some difficult symptoms related to your medical condition. You're saying you're very tired. You might feel like you want to die. That's not an uncommon feeling for a human being to have. Like for someone to, we've always had suicidal ideation within the human population. That's not new. And it's normal to be human and feel these things. And so now you go ask for your assisted suicide. You could have a same-day death in several states now, including New Mexico. They're trying to redefine who could do it. Why are they trying to redefine who can do assisted suicide? Well, one of the problems with assisted suicide is there's too few doctors willing to do it, right? So if you gain nurse practitioners, doctor's assistants, and all these others who are allowed to be involved with doing it, guess what? You have a lot more people willing to do it, okay? The other thing about it is it's simpler for them to set up an assisted suicide clinic if they don't need doctors, right? Nurse practitioners are valuable, but they're cheaper than a doctor. They're trying to eliminate the residency requirement so that people in South Dakota can go to other states to die by assisted suicide. They're trying to allow death by lethal injection. What's lethal injection? Euthanasia. What's euthanasia? Homicide. Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, we have euthanasia. Homicide. It's outright killing is what it is. Not to say that assisted suicide is anything of a lesser crime, but the point of it is it's a little bit more egregious to have someone actually killing you like that. And actually you get more deaths with euthanasia. I don't know if I'm going to go into that, but I think it's actually quite an obvious thing for me to say, that where you've legalized euthanasia, you're going to have more deaths. Because you have to go back to the human element. It's easier to get someone to lethally inject me than it is for me to take the lethal drugs myself. Just think about how we react as humans. So in all jurisdictions where it's assisted suicide but not euthanasia, the numbers are much lower. And it just makes sense when you consider what it means to be human, okay? We're trying to permit assisted suicide by telehealth. Well, hey, it's much easier to approve somebody over the phone than it is to actually have someone come visit you. But if you think about this, if they approve assisted suicide by telehealth, well then, and they get rid of a residency requirement, that means you could contact the doctor. You could be in South Dakota, you can contact the doctor in Oregon by telehealth. If he could approve you by telehealth, then all you've got to do is fly to Oregon to die, right? That's what they're pushing for. They're trying to change the definition of why we allow assisted suicide, because their big push is for chronic conditions, not terminal conditions. And they're trying to establish regional assisted suicide centers. Why? They recognize that the odds of them passing assisted suicide in South Dakota are pretty low. They realize that in Mississippi, it's probably not going to happen. But they also realize that they've legalized it in New Jersey, they've legalized it in New Mexico, in Maine, Oregon, Washington State. Well, if they can set up these centers, then people from all over can go there. I'm not trying to make you feel good, I'm just trying to give you some facts, right? That's all. I'm sorry about that. I'm not supposed to come to you and say, oh, I'm from Canada, I'm going to make you feel bad. Okay, well, the existing approval and reporting system already denies effective oversight of the law. I've already explained it's a self-reporting system. There is no oversight of the law. And think about this. We're talking about life and death. as much as I'm concerned about surgery and medical outcomes and things like that, with assisted suicide, it's life and death. So obviously speaking, these laws are ridiculous because there's no oversight of the law. I'm opposed to all assisted suicide, but nonetheless, I can just look at that and say that's crazy. The law already allows the same physician to approve the assisted suicide, then prescribe the assisted suicide drugs, and then is required to report the assisted suicide. Well, that's just a crazy idea. You know, self-reporting systems protect the physicians who participate in assisted suicide, and it makes effective oversight of the law impossible. It's just impossible. Now the self-reporting system opens the door to lesser trained, qualified medical providers because they're pushing for now nurse practitioners and physician assistants, etc. So expansion. Oregon Governor Kate Brown in July of 2019 signed Bill SB 0579. So what did that do? Oregon had a 15-day waiting period. What it did is it removed that 15-day waiting period and it made it a shorter waiting period, but it also said they could waive the waiting period if you were near to death. So what I'm saying, same-day death. So in 2021, in 81 of the reported assisted suicide deaths, 15 of them had waived the 15-day waiting period, okay? 81 of them had waived the 15-day waiting period. Washington State and Hawaii have been debating expansion of their laws. Now, Washington State didn't pass it, but I might get into that, but I don't think I did in this talk. But instead, they passed an assisted suicide study bill, and they're going to study the expansion of assisted suicide. Well, you don't need to study it unless you plan to do it, right? And one of those things in the Washington State assisted suicide expansion bill, study bill, is they're studying whether euthanasia is more effective than assisted suicide. Well, you don't need to study if euthanasia is more effective than assisted suicide unless you're thinking of expanding your law to include homicide. The Hawaii bill didn't pass, but that was just a miracle. Someone was praying very hard. Vermont expanded their assisted suicide law, and that Vermont law, I'm going to mention in a little bit later, is also allows for assisted suicide by telehealth, okay? So you don't have to. It's one of the things they were also pushing for in Hawaii, and they didn't get it, as I say. But the reason is in Hawaii, there's whole sections of Hawaii where there's no doctor willing to do it. So other than a couple major centers, there's several places where there's just no doctor willing to assist a suicide. And the reason is why would a doctor want to assist your suicide? Like, come on. Like, really? Unless you're really into killing, why would you want to do that? New Mexico legalized a very expanded form of assisted suicide in 2021. So I'm going to get into this a little tiny bit. Why? Because this New Mexico bill is a bit of, how would you say, a template for other states. So what we saw in 2022 is several states had New Mexico-style bills, okay? Other states didn't. So I think what the assisted suicide lobby, the death lobby was doing is they were looking at states where they were unlikely to legalize, and they were going with more older-style bills, which were that older, where there was a 15-day waiting period, etc. And then when the states where they thought they could get it, they were going with more New Mexico-style legislation. Anyway, you don't have to be a doctor. They changed the definition to healthcare provider. Healthcare provider then included licensed physician assistants, osteopathic physicians, and nurses registered in advanced practice. They also expanded the list who could approve who can provide the lethal drugs. And I think this is very concerning because of the fact of the Controlled Substances Act. I think that there's something there that we could do in those states where they are allowing non-physicians to do this. The law expands the list of who may counsel a person. Now that's sort of ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous? No, I'm opposed to all killing, but let's just think this through. I just showed you the data that in Oregon last year, only 2 people were sent for a psychiatric or psychological assessment. Only 2. So why the heck do they have to expand who can do the counseling? Like, that's crazy. Like, honestly, I think it's also because of the concept of having an assisted suicide clinic. It's cheaper to have a professional clinical mental health counselor, whatever that is, rather than a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And then they can have their assisted suicide clinic, and they can call on people who are cheaper for that purposes. I don't see any other reason for it. They waived that a person's condition needs to be confirmed by a second healthcare provider. So in New Mexico, it says that if you've been entered into palliative care, then you don't need a second healthcare provider to approve you. But let's think this out. If someone's asking for assisted suicide, the first doctor only has to say, we will then enroll you in palliative care. Being enrolled in palliative care doesn't mean you're receiving palliative care. It just means you've been determined to be with less than 6 months to live, and we'll enroll you into palliative care. Because once you're enrolled in palliative care, they don't need a second doctor to approve. It just saves a bit of time. The other thing is they always tend to do that anyway. If you look at the Oregon data, it talks about over 90% of these people were enrolled in palliative care. Well, why are they doing that? They're trying to tell people, so they just start doing that automatically. If you're in Oregon and you've asked for assisted suicide, they immediately contact and they try and enroll you into palliative care. The reason for that is a lot of us use the example, we'll say, well, you don't need assisted suicide. Good palliative care will take care of your symptoms and everything. So they just enroll them all into palliative care. So when they go into other states, they can say, well, in Oregon, over 90% of the people who died by assisted suicide were enrolled in palliative care. See what they're doing? They like to lie. Now remember, if you're willing to kill, lying's not a big deal, right? Okay. The law only required a 48-hour waiting period, but again, in New Mexico, they allowed in the law that could be waived. So they only have a 2-day waiting period, but that could be waived if they see you as being near to death. So what does that mean? Same-day death. Same-day death. Think about that. The law allows for a same-day death. A person's request for assisted suicide on a bad day can be their last day, okay? New Mexico assisted suicide law, why am I showing you this? You don't live in New Mexico. Why do I bother showing you this? Because this is a template for future bills, and we're seeing that, and that's what now you might not see that in South Dakota, that kind of a bill, but many states are seeing those type of bills. Oh, I do have the Washington State thing here. So Washington State did not pass their expansion bill, but they did pass this study bill, and I just wanted to point out to you that Section F of that study bill was restrictions based on the requirement that the medication under the chapter be self-administered. So what are they saying is, we're going to study whether you need to self-administer this. Well, if you're not self-administering, it means someone else is administering, and if someone else is administering, what is that? It's called lethal injection, which is euthanasia, which is homicide. And you're not going to study it, of course, if you're not thinking of doing it. That's the good news. No states in 2022 legalized assisted suicide. No new states. Big victory. Connecticut defeated their assisted suicide bill 10 years in a row. Now, what's important about Connecticut is the whole concept of how pro-life people sometimes have to find every way possible to work with others. In Connecticut, that one vote in the Judiciary Committee that killed the bill is a pro-abortion Democrat. So you had a one-vote victory in the Judiciary Committee, and it was a senator in Connecticut who is pro-abortion and very strongly pro-abortion, but she voted against the assisted suicide bill, which killed it in committee. So you would think that that wouldn't happen, but of course, sometimes you have to do everything possible to kill the bill, right? New York did not vote on their assisted suicide bills. Now, this is very interesting. I say that to you because the fact is New York sadly has the votes. New York could have passed it. They have a governor who wanted it. They have both a House and a Senate who clearly, if you look at the data, should be very pro-assisted suicide, and they've not done it. So this is just sort of, sometimes we can't explain, and that's good news for us. Oregon removed the residency requirement recently. I'm going to get into that. And Vermont passed their expansion bill, which allows assisted suicide by telehealth. This, to me, is a big issue. Assisted suicide by telehealth, because combined with the residency requirement question, it means that people will die by assisted suicide in much greater numbers. So the sad news about as I say, Oregon removing its residency requirement, which is I'm going to get into in 1 second, people in South Dakota can die by assisted suicide in Oregon now. Okay? That's sad news. 4 bills to expand. Well, I'm not going to get into all this. I'm going to jump past that. Okay, court cases. There were several court cases. Now, some of this is just getting into information, but I think it's very important. In California, you had the Shavelson case, and this was a very important case, and you also had a conscience rights case in California, and I'm going to get into that too. I'm not going to talk about the final exit network case in Minnesota because it's a case that's been going on for a while, and if you know anything about Minnesota situation, the final exit network's been in court in Minnesota over and over and over again, and they're trying to create a right to assisted suicide, which I don't think they're going to accomplish. And there was the Kleigler case in Massachusetts. So what's that case doing? It's claiming that there's a right to assisted suicide in the Massachusetts Constitution. That's what they're saying, in the Massachusetts State Constitution. That's what they're arguing. So you had this case in Oregon, Gideon versus Brown. That's the first thing I'm going to deal with. So what this case was is a doctor in Oregon, and he was saying, I've got patients out of state, but for assisted suicide, I can't treat my patients out of state. Therefore, he said the assisted suicide residency requirement in Oregon is unconstitutional. So what he was actually arguing is that assisted suicide is what? A form of health care. He was saying assisted suicide is a medical treatment. And he was saying you can't deny my ability as a physician to treat someone from out of state. Now, if you think about it, there's lots of people who go to specialists who are out of state. You might be in South Dakota, and you go to your doctor, and you have a medical condition, and they say, well, we'll send you to the expert who's in that state, and you go there for your treatment, right? That's not uncommon. So the concept of a residency requirement assumes what? That assisted suicide is not medical treatment. And I think this is a big problem here because the assisted suicide movement, the death lobby is pushing hard for what? That assisted suicide be defined as medical treatment. There's nothing medical about it. Like honestly, any of us with a bit of training, and it doesn't take a lot of training, could kill someone. Sadly, I've been doing this work since 1999, so either I'm a bit crazy or whatever, I don't know. I've been doing this work for 23 years full-time. I know how to kill you. I'm not proud of it, but I could do it. It's not a problem. So what happened is, Dr. Gideons was challenging the residency requirement in the assisted suicide law in Oregon. Instead of the Oregon Department of Health actually having the case heard and trying to defend the residency requirement, all they did is they came up with a settlement with the doctor and with Compassion Choices. Isn't that a good name, Compassion Choices? That's the assisted suicide lobby name, Compassion Choices. It's a good name. Anyway, what the Department of Health, the Oregon Health Authority did is they simply dropped the residency requirement. And so therefore now there is an opportunity for suicide tourism in Oregon. Right now, Oregon is saying that you must go to Oregon, you must be approved there, and then you can die there. That's what they're saying right now. So I guess they want your, how would you say, travel dollars to come to Oregon for 15 days? I don't know. On August 26th, a Connecticut woman and a doctor in New York, supported by Compassion Choices, launched a court case in Vermont challenging the Vermont assisted suicide residency requirement. So what's happening is, of course, they won in Oregon because Oregon just simply said, oh, yeah, we'll just remove our residency requirement. So Compassion Choices launched another case, and now it's in Vermont, and they're hoping that Vermont drops the residency requirement. Now remember, I'm telling you, when you read the information from the other side, what are they trying to do? They're trying to set up these assisted suicide regional centers. So Vermont would be one. Oregon's obviously already one. So similar to the Gideon's case in Oregon, this case is claiming that Vermont's assisted suicide residency requirement is unconstitutional. These cases claim that assisted suicide is a form of health care. It's a serious problem. It's a serious problem because if people actually define it that way, I mean officially, not unofficially, officially, we have a problem. We have a serious problem. Shavelson's case. Well, Shavelson's a California doctor who only does assisted suicide. That's all he does. He was a physician before who was a failed physician. He had gone between places as doing different locum work and different things, and people didn't like him. He wasn't a good doctor. So I think he sort of lived in a little apartment. He did some stuff here and there, and suddenly assisted suicide was legalized in 2016 in California. Shavelson became an assisted suicide doctor. That's all he does. Okay. So what happened is that he argued in the court that there's certain disabilities that people have where they're incapable of self-administering. So he's saying if you can't take the drug yourself, then the law should provide an alternative, which is what? Lethal injection. So he was arguing that the assisted suicide law then denies equality to who? People with disabilities. That's what he was arguing. We argued that Shavelson was not actually asking for the law to be extended, but rather that the court would legalize euthanasia. That's what he was actually arguing for. Because assisted suicide and euthanasia are two birds of a feather, but euthanasia is dealt with differently in the law because it's homicide, right? You're actually creating an exception to murder, right? In June 2022, the U.S. District Judge Vince, I'm not going to pronounce his last name, rejected Shavelson's argument and stated that permitting lethal injection would compromise the nature of the act by fundamentally altering the program. So he was right. So currently Shavelson's case is sort of done, but it's not, because Shavelson's now trying to rework his case. Okay, that's what he's doing right now. He's trying to rework his case. And so he thought, well, I lost on these grounds the first time around, so if I rework it, I can relaunch it and try again. That's what he's trying to do. But since then, both of his plaintiffs have died by assisted suicide. So he had two plaintiffs, both died by assisted suicide, so he's looking for a new plaintiff. So if you get a call from Lonnie Shavelson, just say no. California's assisted suicide expansion bill, SB 380, which passed last year, reduced the waiting period from 15 days to 48 hours, but it also allowed same-day death. It allowed the waiving of the waiting period. But what it also did is it said, okay, in our law, you have to have two requests for assisted suicide. And I already explained there's the primary doctor, then there'd be a secondary doctor who signs off. So SB 380 said that if you requested assisted suicide, even to a doctor who opposes assisted suicide, that would be considered your first request. So if you went to, there must be a doctor in the room. If you went to this lady here, if you went to this lady and asked for assisted suicide, and she's like, no, I don't believe in killing you, according to California's rule, that would mean that was the first request. Right? So the doctors, a group of doctors, including the Christian Medical Dental Society, the Catholic Physicians Guilds, etc., got together and they launched a court case because it said, this is infringing on our conscience rights because it's forcing us to do what? Participate in the law. We believe assisted suicide is absolutely wrong, but your law is forcing us to participate. And they recently just actually won that case. So the conscience rights not only protect medical... So here's the important thing. Forcing doctors to be complicit in the law is a big push for the assisted suicide lobby. And the reason is, as I already said, there's very few doctors willing to be complicit with the law. Therefore, they're trying to come up with these ways to the back door. Now, let me explain something to you. In my own province of Ontario, okay, don't hold it against me. I'm a Canadian. I'm sorry. I haven't inflicted any of this hockey talk on you yet, so it's okay. Nonetheless, in my own province of Ontario, the Ontario College of Physicians has a rule. Doctors don't have to do euthanasia, because it's euthanasia in Canada, lethal injection. They don't have to do it, but they have to do something called an effective referral. So that means a doctor who's pro-life, if they receive a request for euthanasia, they don't have to do euthanasia, but they have to send you to someone who will do it, according to Ontario College of Physicians. And of course, the doctors have been fighting that, and some of them have actually left Ontario. Some of them are good doctors who are good friends of mine, people who I would want to go to if I needed a doctor. They've left Ontario because they say, I don't need that. I was at a talk in a place in Northern Ontario, and after my talk, this doctor comes up to me, he says, I'm 63 years old, and I'm retiring right now. I'm closing up my practice. And he said to me, the reason is, and I'd mentioned about the conscience issue in my talk, and he says, the reason is the conscience rights issue. He said, I'm never going to do euthanasia. I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to refer for it. Just like he said he would never do abortion, he would never refer for abortion. He said, but I don't need to be dragged before some tribunal because I wasn't willing to kill someone. So he said, I don't need the money anymore. I had no plans to retire until that rule came along, but I'm retiring because I don't need this. So here, all those people in that community who had a good pro-life doctor lose a good pro-life doctor because of those rules, okay? Think about it. We need pro-life doctors because you and I want to go to a doctor who shares our values. And why? Because we're human. I'm not saying all doctors are terrible people. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is you're a human being. Sometimes you might be in such an emotional distress that you need a doctor who's going to say to you, no, I'm not going to do that. You need one who's going to protect you. You need a doctor who shares your values because you're human. It's not that you're a terrible person. Anyway, on September 2nd, which is very recent, District Judge, this is in California, Fernandez, and I'm not going to pronounce the last name, agreed that SB 380 violated the First Amendment rights of doctors by requiring them to participate in assisted suicide. And the judge granted a preliminary injunction barring the state from compelling healthcare providers from documenting a patient's request for assisted suicide. Now, this is only a preliminary injunction, so there'll still be a court case, but we feel very good about that preliminary injunction. It'll probably be standing up. I believe it will. Okay. The other thing I think what they did right in this case is they argued based on freedom of speech, which I think was very important. The Kleigler case in Massachusetts. So what they're arguing there is Dr. Kleigler is arguing that in Massachusetts, the Constitution acknowledges a right to assisted suicide. Now, nowhere in the Massachusetts Constitution does it say anything about assisted suicide or killing or anything like that. But he's saying that, okay? And this has been argued before the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Now, I have to brag a bit. Now, I shouldn't brag ever, but I'm going to brag a bit. Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, like many other groups, we put in a brief to the Supreme Court on the case. We were the only ones who were actually asked to speak before the court at the Supreme Court level in response to the case. So when they actually heard the trial, they had all the briefs come in. You hear the plaintiff, you hear in this case, it was the state. And I thank God that they did that, because if you actually were watching that day, and I was watching the proceedings online, I was watching it, I felt that the Massachusetts Attorney General was throwing the case. I was disgusted by how the Massachusetts Attorney General was defending their assisted suicide law. I thought for sure. And then, of course, our lawyer came up and did a fabulous job. He was only given 10 minutes, but then they started asking him questions, and it turned into 20-something minutes when it was done, and he gave all the responses that needed to be done. But then what happened is Dobbs came down, and Dobbs is actually based on what? Glucksberg. That's what Dobbs is based on. It's based on Glucksberg. What's Glucksberg? It was a decision that said there's no right to assisted suicide in America. That's the Glucksberg decision. So then the Massachusetts Supreme Court then sent out a question to all those who had sent in briefs and everything, if they thought that the Dobbs decision affects the Massachusetts case. And of course, we argued that it did, because our whole brief was based on what? Glucksberg, right? And of course, we said that there cannot be a right to assisted suicide in Massachusetts because of the fact that this is not anything of a, how would you say, it's not a value or something that's been longly held within our American system. In fact, in the US, assisted suicide is illegal almost everywhere, prohibited almost everywhere. And here I have my notes on it. We were the only group that opposed it, that actually responded to that request. And we argue that since Dobbs was based on Glucksberg, and since Glucksberg determined that liberty interests not deeply rooted in the nation's history do not qualify on being a protected liberty interest. And therefore, there cannot be a right to assisted suicide in Massachusetts. Now let's think this one through further. Let's say they were to declare a right to assisted suicide in Massachusetts. Think about this. Can you limit a right? It's an important question, because they legalized euthanasia in Canada, but they didn't call it a right, but they came very close. Can I limit a right? If you have a right to assisted suicide, can I say to you that if you're not an adult, you can't have it? No, I don't. They can come up with a law like that, but it would be struck. If they said you had to be 18 years old or older, well, why wouldn't a 17-year-old be able to have assisted suicide if they were a right? Right? If there were a right to assisted suicide, could they limit it to people who are terminally ill? They could pass a law that says that, but that would be struck down. Because why would you, if you have a chronic condition and there's a right, why would you be denied assisted suicide because you're not terminal? Think about it. You can't limit a right. Now, if you create an exception to the law, it's a different issue. A right to assisted suicide in any state would be horrific, like it is in Canada right now. Assisted suicide lobbies developed these new lethal drug cocktails. Now let's talk about this. A lot of people think this is all about being, they talk about death with dignity. Death with dignity. Okay, so we're going to have these nice, safe, legal, easy deaths, and everyone's afraid of a bad death, so they're saying, well, at least then I don't have to suffer. So the assisted suicide lobby developed these new lethal drug cocktails to lower the cost of assisted suicide. And these cocktails were developed with known side effects. The Seattle Times reported in March of 2017 that first secondol alternative turned out to be too harsh, burning patients' mouths and throats, causing them to scream in pain. Death with dignity, screaming in pain. I'm opposed to all killing, so don't get me wrong, but the concept of people screaming in pain so we can kill them just is beyond me. The second drug mix led to these long, drawn-out deaths, instead up to the Seattle Times article referred to a 31-hour death. But of course, in Oregon, there had been longer ones, 104 hours, etc. An article published in The Atlantic in January 2019 stated, an advocacy organization called End of Life Washington briefly advised prescribing a drug mixture with the sedative chloral hydrate to about 70 patients. It was 67, actually. And then this is what Robert Wood, the medical director of the organization, said. We know this is going to put you to sleep, and it's pretty sure it's going to kill you. This is what he's saying to the Atlantic. It worked, but with the tragic catch, in a few cases, the chloral hydrate burned people's throats, causing severe pain just as they expected relief. Medical Express reported on September 8, 2020, a little-known secret not publicized by advocates of aiding dying was that while most deaths were speedy, others were very slow. Some patients lingered for 6 to 9 hours, a few more than 3 days. Assisted suicide is clearly not what it appears to be. Now, why were they coming up with this cheaper way? Well, what happened is the Seconal drug, the company that produced it, had sold the rights to it to another company, and they jacked up the price. So obviously speaking, the death lobby was looking for a cheaper way to kill. And so they came up with their own alternatives, and they've been working on this. There's been all these, changes and changes and changes to it. Many people support assisted suicide based on the fear of dying a bad death. I've been arguing over and over again and saying, well, when you're talking about assisted suicide, well, why don't we talk about how it's actually done? Because a lot of people would say, well, I'm not sure if I want that. Shavelson stated in a recent assisted suicide practitioner posting, so you need to know that the assisted suicide lobby, they have their own little website where they share information with each other on, and they then share their experiences, etc. And this is what he wrote. He says, yes, I know this all sounds terrible, and it makes one wonder why we use, I need a doctor to pronounce the name. Thank you. First, extensive data shows that having amitriptyline as part of the aid in dying medication leads to more reliable results, meaning you're more likely to die quicker, right? Significantly decreasing the risk of prolonged deaths. When patients are offered medications that are less reliable but taste somewhat better and don't burn, they invariably select reliability. So he's justifying why people are suffering as he's killing them. The assisted suicide lobby developed these by doing human trials. So when we're doing trials on medication, you don't do human trials, you do animal trials first, right? You try with, and then what happens is when they come up with things that are working, then they'll do some human trials. But what they did here is they said, okay, you've been approved for assisted suicide, so we're going to use this lethal drug cocktail. So let's think about it. Because someone asked for assisted suicide, did they ask to be part of a human trial? I think what happened here, that they did these things without full consent. If you look at what was going on, people were not given consent because they were simply told, this is the drugs we use for assisted suicide. But in fact, they were going through a human trial. Well, let's think this through. If you're okay with killing, why would you care that you're doing human trials on people without their consent? Why would you give two hoots about that? And guess what? Almost all of them died anyway, so it doesn't matter because they weren't going to come back and complain when they're dead, right? On March 14, 2022, the Colorado Sun published an article about Dr. Jennifer Gradiani, an assisted suicide doctor who had approved at least 3 assisted suicides for people with anorexia nervosa. So what happened is this doctor redefined anorexia, which is defined as a chronic condition. She defined it as a terminal condition. So in 2021, the Oregon Assisted Suicide Report lists anorexia nervosa as a reason for assisted suicide. So I don't know if 1 person, 2 people, or 3 people with anorexia died by assisted suicide in 2021. All I know it's listed on the report as one of the reasons for the approval for assisted suicide. Now, what's important about anorexia is it's a chronic condition. I wrote an article about this, like, I'm not just a funny-looking face, I did some research, and I found this one research study that had gone over 22 years on anorexia. So it was a very long-term study on anorexia, and it looked at, and I didn't put it in my data, so I might be jumping a bit here, but anyway, the point of it is that is actually treated as the definitive research study on anorexia. And it showed that, yes, there were some people who died over that period of time of 22 years, but it also showed that over 22 years, it was about 69% fully recovered from anorexia. That means some didn't. I understand it's a terrible condition. I'm not arguing that it's not a terrible condition. But also what's interesting about it is there was actually a very low number who actually died during that 22 years in the study. And what was also that was interesting about it is in the study, it never indicated where the person who died, who was part of the study, died of anorexia or other causes. So I don't know how many of them actually died of anorexia. But obviously speaking, very few died by anorexia over that 22 years, which means it's a what? It's a chronic condition. Vermont passes assisted suicide expansion bill, I already mentioned that, and it defines it as a healthcare service, and they also approve it by telehealth. Fighting assisted suicide. Now I got about 10 minutes left. I've given you my story a little bit about being human. Let me tell you a little story right off the bat. I should have started with this. You probably would have found my talk more interesting if I'd done that. Lately, we've been involved with the case of a 23-year-old young man. He lives near Toronto, and he has type 1 diabetes. And he was approved for euthanasia. He was originally scheduled to die by euthanasia on September 22nd. And his mother was very upset. His mother was absolutely upset. She's a Christian woman. She was just so angry and upset. So she went a bit berserk. She called us up, and we got involved with it, and she set up this petition online, and we helped her with another petition, and I helped her with her letters and everything, and she went right after that euthanasia doctor. She went right after him who approved this. Like, she was thinking, my son is 23, so what happened is during COVID, he got quite depressed, her son, and he wasn't very good with taking his insulin. He wasn't eating properly, so he lost all his eyesight in the one eye, and the other one he's lost quite a bit of eyesight, which is, if you don't control your diabetes, you get these sort of things happening. But right now he's stable. I'm not saying he's stable emotionally, but he's stable physically. But the doctor had approved him for euthanasia, and she went right after that doctor. So then the doctor changed the day from September, because she demanded that there be another assessment of her son. And so the doctor agreed to that. He says, I'll make it September 28th. I'll back it off by 6 days. And this is the euthanasia clinic in Toronto. Just so you know, we have a euthanasia clinic in Toronto. I'm not proud about it. I was not happy about it. But nonetheless. So he said, we'll do another assessment. We're going to back it off by 6 days. And then a lot of pressure was put on that doctor, a lot of pressure. Another little catch here is that doctor works at the Catholic hospital. But he says he doesn't do any euthanasia at the Catholic hospital. It's not allowed. He works at the euthanasia clinic on the side, right? But as a full-time physician at a Catholic hospital, it wasn't looking very good that his name was showing up in all these petitions and media articles and everything as the doctor who was going to kill this boy on, at this point now, September 28th. So then he decided he wasn't going to do it. So the doctor said he wasn't going to do it. Now here's the problem. How the Canadian law works is this boy has been approved. He's approved. So if another doctor comes along saying, I'm willing to kill you, he will still die by euthanasia. So anyway, this is what's going on. We got heavily involved in that case. So we have a helpline that we have, and I think that's been very important. We've had quite a few people contact our helpline. I've been dealing with a guy in the Niagara region. He's 61 years old, and he's got several of his discs in his back that are degenerated, and he's in a lot of pain. And he said for 18 years he's been seeking surgery, and he doesn't understand why he's not being approved for surgery when all these other people have had surgery on their backs to fuse it so that at least he's not in pain all the time. And so he's now been approved for euthanasia. And he contacted us not because he was wanting to argue with us or anything. He said, I want euthanasia. I want surgery. I've got no interest in euthanasia. But he says, I can't live this way any longer. I've been in pain for so long. I'm giving up. I'm done, okay? Now, I'm not saying that's a good answer that he's saying to me, but what I'm saying is it's a human reality, isn't it? It's a human reality. Think of what it means to be human. So how do we fight assisted suicide? Well, I think this also fits some ways with abortion, but nonetheless, we need to call it what it is. You know, we want to get into this arguing, oh, it's not necessary, we can have palliative care. Well, I can agree, we need good palliative care. I'm not going to argue that for a second. But what I will say to you, we have to call it what it is. This is about giving doctors the right and allowed to kill people. Okay? We have to be very clear about what it is. We oppose assisted suicide because these laws are about one person, usually a physician, sometimes a nurse, being directly involved with causing the death of another person. We oppose killing, okay? Killing's not a good idea. If you were to say to me, oh, I think we should have a law, yeah, this is 2 minutes. If you were to say to me, I think we should have a law that gives our doctors the right to kill us, do you think you would think that's a good idea? No, I don't think so. No. Creating exceptions to homicide or manslaughter, that would be euthanasia. These are not good ideas. These are not good ideas. The term aid in dying is used for both euthanasia and assisted suicide. The other side is redefining the language. I'm going to go back. That's the anaerobic. We need to talk about what it is. The other side claims these are deaths with dignity. That's a nice term, a death with dignity. I want a death with dignity. Well, we all sort of want a death with dignity, don't we? They describe them as peaceful, quick, and painless. We know that many of these deaths are not necessarily peaceful, certainly not quick, and often not painless. We believe in caring for people, not killing them. We need to talk about this. They say, my body, my choice. Well, it's a lie. It's a lie. We've heard that before, but it's a lie. Assisted suicide is not about autonomy. It's about what? It's about abandonment. You know, when the law requires or allows someone else to be directly involved with putting lethal drugs or prescribing lethal drugs for you, when did that become about autonomy, especially since usually I'm in a downtime of my life? Many of these people requesting assisted suicide have issues related to capacity. It doesn't matter in Oregon because only 2 people were sent for psychiatric or psychological assessments last year, so it doesn't really matter to them because they're all pro-assisted suicide doctors. They're looking at someone saying, yeah, you might be emotionally distraught, you might be depressed, but I wouldn't want to live like you either. These people are experiencing hopelessness, despair, alienation, cognitive distortions. Assisted suicide is more about abandonment. It's about abandoning people. Talk about the lethal drug experiments. Talk about them. I think they broke the Nuremberg Code. Think about it. We should not be just focusing on palliative care. Now, it actually doesn't help us if we argue against assisted suicide based on palliative care, because the assisted suicide lobby, and my time's up, but I'm almost done. I'm stealing a minute from somebody. That's all I'm going to do, okay? The assisted suicide lobby, they will say to you, oh, we're all for palliative care. We just believe in more choices. You know, we must focus on what it is. It's not that assisted suicide is not necessary, it's that it's wrong, okay? We must work with people from all political points of view. I mentioned to you about Connecticut, okay? We must talk about personal experience. Stories. You know, the best thing about our talk last night and this morning is you talking about your family, the story. The story. We're fighting these issues. The other side abuses stories. We must talk about stories. You know, there's lots of good stories. There was a story that was used in the past here in South Dakota of a woman, and a lady came up to me and talked to me about it, and that's how you fought a previous assisted suicide bill. You need stories. We need to talk about how this affects people. Canada, well, I can talk to you but I've already told I have no time. We've got lots of stories. Trampling on rights. We've got lots of stories in Canada. And it's terrible. And if you get on my list, you'll see all these crazy stories. Use the Canadian stories. I'll send them to you. It's crazy what's going on. We live in a culture of loneliness, isolation, and social abandonment. We do. I'm not saying you're living in that because you're in South Dakota. You seem to be caring here. We live in that in Canada for sure. And I think Eastern U.S. is more isolationist and everything. Sorry. The factors that drive people to consider suicide or seek an assisted suicide are being normalized within our culture. There are more people whose lives are living alone, they lack significant community, they feel hopeless, or they feel there's no purpose in their life. There's more people like that than ever before. This is driving the assisted suicide. People are seeking assisted suicide as a way out of deaths of despair. They're seeking a way out. And we're normalizing that in our culture, okay? Assisted suicide threatens my life. I'm going to finish here. I know. I'm sorry. I know you're doing your job. Thank you. And you got a smile on your face too. It's really good. I have to say this to you. Human experience tells us that it's normal for you as a person when you're experiencing serious illness or personal difficulties, and also loneliness makes it a real another factor, that you're also going to fear for your future. It's normal. It's normal that you might question your purpose for living. Even if you're a person of great faith, questioning is a normal human thing for people to do. You might experience existential distress, situational depression, loss of hope, meaning, value. Suffering alone, serious problem. Loneliness, isolation, depression, fear, you know, these things are leading to people wanting assisted suicide and euthanasia. The culture of abandonment leads to assisted suicide. We must produce a culture that cares. We're about caring. We're about love. There's only one way to fight the death culture, and that's by caring and love. Information's not enough. My data on Oregon just is interesting. It won't stop it, right? We need to care. Essentially, people who feel that their life lacks value or feel that there's no one who cares for them, they need to be offered purpose, support, genuine hope, and significant community. We need to be significant community to others. The answer is to care, to be with others as they journey through their difficult time of their life. I cannot change the world, but I can change the world around me.